let me start off by saying that if you watch the news these days, you're likely to see two types of big stories about drugs. One is the opioid crisis, of course, which a lot of critics blame on weak regulation of physicians and the pharmaceutical industry. And you can see an example of this type of critique on the right there, physicians for responsible opioid prescribing. And then you might also read stories about mass incarceration. In other words, the astounding numbers of Americans, especially racial minorities, who are in prison or in the criminal justice system. And this is a problem that critics blame in part on overly harsh drug war laws. And you can see on the left there a rally of the Drug Policy Alliance on this issue. So an opening question here is, how do we find ourselves with both of these problems at the same time, with our drug laws being both too weak and too strong at the same time? And I'm a historian, so it may not shock you to discover that I believe that we face this situation in part because of an act of forgetting. Historians obviously hate forgetting. As you can see from these headlines, which happen to be from my hometown paper, the Buffalo News, today's opioid crisis is usually described as a recent and shocking phenomenon. A departure in which addiction left its traditional home among poor urban racial minorities and found its way for the first time into these once wholesome white suburbs. And that's where you get this whole, quote, new breed of addict, a new breed of drug dealer type story that I've highlighted on the slide. But this story is almost astonishingly wrong. As I'm going to show here, if I can find my button, there we go. These kinds of stories have been in newspapers for a very long time. These stories are here from the 1960s. Here are ones from the 1950s. You can see pet pills and goofballs. Here are from the late 1940s, slaves of the devil's capsules and things of this sort. Even this, I believe, is from the 1930s. Sleeping pills often lead to dope habit. And then all the way back to the 1910s, you have articles about early barbiturate addiction and overdose. And so if you were to read the articles under these headlines, you would find, number one, obviously, addiction to prescription drugs, or to pharmaceuticals rather, has been a really widespread phenomenon for a very long time. And number two, the media have been covering this problem the entire time. And what's more, in the articles, they all sound like today's articles, saying this is this astonishing new phenomenon that we've never seen before. So this just compounds the mystery, really. Why has addiction to pharmaceuticals been so widespread? And how is it possible to continually discover it as if it were something new? What's the purpose of this bizarre, long-running national surprise over what's been an omnipresent phenomenon? So today, I'm going to remember America's history of addiction to pharmaceuticals with the hope that this will help us better understand the problems we face today with opioid addiction and with the drug war. And it'll show that these two phenomena are connected, and we're unlikely to solve them if we continue to think about them as entirely separate. So the first wave of addiction to pharmaceuticals in the United States began in the late 19th century as the result of two broad developments. One, technological advances such as the hypodermic needle that made drugs easier to take, and the Industrial Revolution that permitted faster and cheaper production of purer drugs like morphine and later Bayer's heroin in 1898, and also cocaine from Parke Davis in 1882. With the greater availability and purity of drugs, plus the greater number of injuries in the Civil War, the addiction rate in the United States went up by a factor of 7, most likely, from a maximum of about 0.72 per 1,000 people in the 1840s to a maximum of about 4.6 per 1,000 in the mid-1890s. So how did all these people come to be addicted? Well, a lot of people are familiar with so-called patent medicines like these, many of which did indeed have narcotic ingredients, but these didn't actually cause a lot of new addiction because the amount of narcotics in them was quite small, and they often didn't list the narcotics on their ingredient labels, thus impeding the awareness of what you were taking, which is an important part of addiction. Now, it was more these guys, physicians, who caused the vast majority of addiction. Saint morphine was a standard go-to drug during an era when suffering was an omnipresent part of life. And because most narcotics came from physicians, most of the people in the 19th century who became addicted were from the doctor visiting classes. In other words, they were white, native-born, middle-class women, equally divided between cities and rural areas. And as the addiction rate increased, reformers who, in the medical professions particularly, they saw this, they were horrified by this, but they were also deeply sympathetic. They saw people with addiction as innocent victims of a market for drugs that had careened out of control in a rapidly industrializing era. So, for example, medical authorities, they responded to this by campaigning to heighten professional standards so that doctors could protect patients from those drug markets instead of exposing them to the risks. And they urged physicians to prescribe less and to not tell patients what they had prescribed for them because there were so few limits on what patients could buy on their own. The government got directly into the game in the early 20th century after expose journalists raised public fears of those patent medicines. And this campaign was a contributor to America's first national consumer protection law, the Food and Drug Act of 1906. This act required drug manufacturers to provide honest labeling and on that labeling to list any narcotic ingredient. It also established a new arm of the state, the Food and Drug Administration, that would enforce that requirement. Notice that the FDA did not outlaw the sale of anything. It was not a drug war law designed to restrict consumer choices about narcotics. Instead, it was designed to enable drug markets by informing consumers so that they could make rational choices. As Harvey W. Wiley, the primary reformer involved in this, said, the goal was to, quote, make sure that the innocent consumer may get what he thinks he is buying. Now, opiates and cocaine were medicines, but there was no formal definition of what a medicine was or any legal limits on how they could be advertised or sold, for the most part. And with medical commerce being so extensive for so long, the drugs also earned a popular following outside the medical system among working class men who purchased the drugs from disreputable druggists and or street peddlers in urban vice districts, as they were called. Now, reformers also noticed this was happening, and they had a very different view of these kinds of drug users. They didn't see them as innocent consumers in need of protection from a market, but as willful deviants and criminals who were choosing their fate. Now, this attitude came from a lot of different places, primarily from class prejudices against the poor, but it was also linked to racial stereotypes. So, for example, you can see here headlines about African-American men driven to rape white women on cocaine. And this picture there you can see is a smirking Chinese man luring white women into an opium den and into eventually what at the time was called white slavery. So to reformers, this world of drug use represented a very different type of social problem than women getting morphine from physicians. And as a result, they sought to deal with it through very different mechanisms. They passed the Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act of 1914, which is an interesting law. It criminalized non-medical use of morphine, heroin, and cocaine, making them America's first prescription-only drugs. It imposed strong controls over legal narcotic sales. It was a regulator of pharmaceutical commerce, much stronger than the Food and Drug Administration. And by the end of the 1920s, had established a police agency, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, one of whose primary goals was to launch a punitive campaign of arresting so-called dope fiends who were transgressing the law. By 1928, narcotics violators arrested under the Harrison Act made up nearly a third of America's federal prisoners. And people with addiction were so hated and feared that regular prison wardens didn't want them infecting their good, honest criminal populations. So in 1935, the federal government opened the Lexington Narcotic Farm, or NARCO, to house them. So let me just step back a minute and characterize this first step. You had the first wave of addiction to pharmaceuticals, and in response, reformers in the US government worked with the medical professions to divide drug use into two categories that they invented, called medical and non-medical use. And they developed two separate drug control systems to regulate those two different types of use. One, as you can see on the left, was a system of relatively weak consumer protection based on the 1906 Food and Drug Act. It was designed for substances labeled medicines and the socially favored drug users called patients or consumers. The others, you can see on the right, was a much stronger system of criminal punishment based on the 1914 Harrison Act. It was designed for drugs labeled dope and for the poorer, increasingly non-white drug users called dope fiends or drug abusers. Now, to a historian, this two-tiered setup looks really familiar, especially because when it took place. It looks like a lot of other reforms in this so-called progressive era. Reformers in the progressive era invented the American regulatory state to rationalize and govern the nation's consumer markets, but they were also obsessed with economic and racial hierarchies, and they also did things like invent racial segregation, eugenic sterilization campaigns, and immigration restriction. So from this perspective, what we see is not the development of two separate systems of drug control, but rather a single, unequal, you might say even segregated, system that governed Americans' access to addictive substances. So, how well did this system do in limiting opiate addiction and the harms related to opiate use? Well, the system on the right, the one that offered very little bit punishment for non-medical drug users, that famously had very little positive effect. The number of so-called non-medical drug users didn't go down. In fact, the most important thing that happened was that they switched from the difficult to conceal smoking opium to the easy to smuggle heroin, which was not a switch that was good necessarily for their health. But on the left side, that regime did a remarkable job in reducing the overall volume of medical opiate sales. That's a line that more or less shows per capita opioid sales. More impressive, that huge drop was accomplished without, as far as I'm able to tell, any corresponding rise in overdose deaths. In other words, medical opioid users don't seem to have just switched to illegal markets when the new restrictions were imposed. This was a genuinely successful reform. So how can we explain that? Well, this overall drop that you see there in the graph, that actually masks two different trends. On the one hand, casual prescribing of narcotics dropped very sharply. People stopped prescribing narcotics because you had hay fever. But prescribing to people with addiction dropped much more slowly, only as the number of people with addiction declined as they aged out or they died. And technically, this was illegal. It was illegal, according to federal law, to prescribe opiates to someone with addiction. But physicians enjoyed a lot of protections, especially if they practiced in contexts that looked very different from that urban dope fiend stereotype. In other words, physicians working in rural areas or small towns who prescribed opiates as a small part of their practice to just a few respectable patients that they favored. In these kind of situations, they were very difficult to convict. So the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, when they tried to convict doctors for providing opiates to people with addiction, they only succeeded 1 out of every 10 cases that they brought. But when they tried to convict other people who were not doctors, they succeeded 7 out of every 10 cases. So you can see it was just difficult to stop doctors from doing this. So in other words, this initial opiate policy can be seen as a natural experiment of sorts, where the same public health crisis, widespread use of an addictive drug, it was subjected to two very different kinds of policy responses. On the one hand, the war on drugs was implemented, and it didn't do a very good job. It failed to care for people with addiction, and it didn't do a great job of preventing new cases of addiction. But on the other hand, the more socially favored groups were governed not by a war, but by a kind of a consumer protection policy that had some versions of what would today be called harm reduction, that tried to protect consumers from addiction and provide them with health care if they ended up contracting it anyway. So that's what the experiment looks like to me as a historian almost 100 years later. But authorities at the time read this experiment in a very different way. Instead of thinking that the consumer protection set of policies were successful and effective, they didn't attribute that success to the policies. They thought the success was because the policies had been aimed at good patients. In other words, that good white people had voluntarily chosen to stop using drugs, After all, it was pretty invisible to authorities that many physicians were providing them with morphine. And they assumed that those people in the cities, the immigrants and the racialized poor people, that they had chosen to continue using drugs, not because the policies were bad, but because they were bad people. This misreading was obviously very unfortunate for non-medical drug users, but it turned out to be disastrous for everyone on both sides of the equation, because it paved the groundwork for a second and even larger wave of addiction to pharmaceuticals that followed fast on the heels of the first one. It involved different drugs. In this case, the drugs were barbiturates and amphetamines. The first barbiturate sedative was released in 1906, Vironal, and the first amphetamine stimulant, Benzedrine, was released in the 1930s. And as you can see in this graph, their use really took off after enforcement of the Harrison Act got serious in the late 1920s. And in a lot of cases, physicians replaced their use of morphine and cocaine with barbiturates and amphetamines. By the 1950s, as many as 1/3 or more of Americans had used either a barbiturate or a tranquilizer or an amphetamine in any given year, and very large numbers of them used these drugs regularly. All of this use, predictably, led to a catastrophic epidemic of addiction and overdose. Between 1933 and 1953, fatal barbiturate overdoses alone rose nearly 5-fold, and the death rate rose from 1.7 per 100,000 people to 7.6 per 100,000 people. Just to give those numbers some context, all prescription opioid deaths in 2016 all opioid deaths in 2016 were 13.3 per 100,000, and just prescription deaths were under 5. So in other words, there were a higher rate of death from prescription barbiturates in the 1950s than from prescription opioids in the 2010s. So this is not an insignificant public health catastrophe that happened in the 50s, very significant. And because barbiturates and amphetamines were not derived from plants, and there was no street manufacturing of them as of yet, they were available only through pharmacies. Both legal and illegal sales tended to go through pharmacies. And that meant that most of this use, most of this addiction, and most of these deaths took place amongst white middle-class men, and especially women, the ones who had supposedly stopped using drugs after the 1906 Food Drug Act. The result was situations like what happened in the tiny town of Kiel, Wisconsin. And Wisconsin comes in here because they kept amazing archives of their state medical and pharmacy boards. A physician in Kiel, Wisconsin was discovered to be prescribing a very large amount of amphetamine. And when the state medical board questioned him about this, he was completely open and even proud of his quick turn to the prescription pad. He told them, among other things, that he prescribed amphetamines to, quote, make patients feel a little peppier, to help women, quote, keep up with the housework. And sometimes he said he gave them a prescription simply because they're paying for an office call and want relief. And they don't want you to say, go home and take 2 aspirins. In other words, these people were considered to be consumers who were pursuing health, and as a result, there just wasn't a lot of concern about their drug use. There was not a lot of protection for them in this case. As this doctor assured the authorities, don't worry about it because my town, quote, has no black market for drugs, at least nothing like the city. I read that when I was in the archives and I thought, are you crazy? Of course, there's no black market for drugs in your town. You personally are providing everyone with all the drugs they could possibly want. Why would there need to be a black market? But it just shows how deeply these racialized ideas about what drug use and abuse constituted at this time, and how they could be used to protect markets, quite dangerous markets for addictive drugs like barbiturates and amphetamines. So it wasn't just that they could lead to better policy they could lead to better policy as they did with opioids, but they could also lead to dangerous lack of restrictions in other drug markets. Now, by the end of World War II, barbiturate and amphetamine problems had become serious enough that medical experts and policy reformers looked for ways to strengthen government regulation of these markets. They tried stirring up a panic about barbiturates, they called goofballs, and amphetamines, they called them pet pills, and tried to add them to the Harrison Act. But despite all the furor, there was no luck. The system held. There was no that kind of extra motivation of scary foreign rapists wasn't part of the story. That wasn't enough to force regulatory change until, and so fatalities continue to mount until two broad political and cultural changes in the 1960s and 70s produced new political opportunities. On the one hand was civil rights activism by women and African Americans who challenged the cultural logic that helped justify treating medical and non-medical drug users so differently. So on the one hand, they helped authorities see non-white drug users more sympathetically. And on the other hand, they highlighted the problems of women who were the ones most exposed to pharmaceutical addiction because of their greater use of the medical system. A second development was the emergence of the modern consumer movement, a new political coalition pushing to protect consumers by building muscular state capacity to regulate markets. And so starting with John F. Kennedy's White House Conference to Rethink American Drug Policy in 1962, and culminating in Richard Nixon's 1970 Controlled Substances Act, new consumer protection laws remade pharmaceutical commerce. The key, let's see, I think I have a slide, yeah. The key was that new stringent market controls, much like Harrison's market controls, were extended to all potentially addictive drugs, not just opioids and cocaine. And at the same time, the laws passed around this time extended healthcare, particularly methadone maintenance, to drug users, even non-medical drug users. So the best parts of that system, that consumer protection system, were expanded to include all pharmaceuticals and were also extended to include people who had purchased their drugs non-medically. This, in effect, took the part of the experiment that had worked and tried to build all of drug policy around it. The result was unambiguously successful. You can see there on the right of this graph, sales of sedatives and amphetamines plummeted by as much as 50%, but when those sales dropped, they didn't produce a lot of new overdoses and street use. Prescription drug-related emergency room visits dropped by as much as 65% during this period. So again, successful when you reduce prescribing in combination with an aggressive ramp up of treatment for people who contracted addiction. Now, not everybody was happy about these changes. Some, particularly people who had been accustomed to being able to purchase these drugs through physicians and pharmacists, the people who'd bought these drugs over the course of the century, saw it as another entitlement loss to big government in the civil rights era. A Arizona man, for example, wrote to his congressman in 1973, quote, "I suppose I could be considered one of the silent majority. Our freedoms, they're disappearing, our freedoms, down the bureaucratic drain." Another woman complained directly to the FDA, quote, "I feel that my rights as a citizen of the United States has been infringed upon. Whatever happened to free enterprise, or do we really have something else?" A Wisconsin man wrote to his state representative complaining that Benzedrine could no longer be purchased in bottles of 1,000 pills. He said, "But the wife must have these to live a decent life." And these and a bunch of other letters share the instantly recognizable rhetoric of, quote, silent majority whites courted by Richard Nixon through appeals to their lost status in the face of the civil rights movement and other social changes of the era. And the newly emerging political coalition of conservatives that rode these sentiments soon brought an end to this brief moment of drug law reforms, and it would reestablish that moral divide between drugs and medicine that had, for the most part, characterized 20th century policy. On the one hand, starting with the Rockefeller drug laws of 1973, law and order politicians competed to pass the harshest possible anti-narcotic laws, a process that culminated in a mid-1980s scare over, quote, crack cocaine that produced or helped to produce an era of mass incarceration so racially disparate that some have called it the new Jim Crow. On the other hand, as President Reagan implemented deregulation of American markets, the pharmaceutical industry rebounded with new sedatives like Halcyon and Xanax, new stimulants like Adderall, and new narcotics like OxyContin. all of which were hyped as technological miracles that had solved old problems of addiction. And by the way, it wasn't just opioids whose use shot up starting in the 90s. It was all these psychoactive pharmaceuticals. They all shot up in the 90s dramatically. So in other words, there was once again a sharp and massive rise in drug use, divided between relatively lightly controlled medicines provided preferentially to white patients and punitively punished drugs that were marketed predominantly in the non-white communities where illicit market structures were the best developed. It's not an accident that these things happened at the same time. In fact, pharmaceutical policy and drug war policy have been evolving in tandem for a century. And that's because they are part of the same story, the story of how the US governs access to psychoactive substances that are potentially addictive. And in this story, the worst periods have been those with deep racialized divisions between medical and non-medical drugs and drug use. In these periods, pharmaceutical companies have a relatively free hand to market dangerous and addictive medicines, even as non-medical drug users must navigate illegal markets with dangerous products and authorities tasked with punishing them rather than protecting or caring for them. These problems are related, of course. Weak pharmaceutical regulations help enable popular markets for drugs that in turn require drug wars to rein them back in. So in other words, it did not work to carve out some drug consumers as worthy of protection and care while seeing others as deviants and criminals. This ensured in some ways that the next epidemic was always brewing, even as we handled the current one. To escape this trap, I think, requires using history to look beyond a system of drug control that was, quite frankly, built alongside racial segregation a century ago. It doesn't make sense for us to still be using the concepts and structures designed during that time to try to resolve those problems today. So only by using that history to see some of the not so desirable origins of these policies can we bridge the gap between consumer advocates calling for stricter regulation of big pharma and drug war reformers calling for radical deregulation of drug markets. Both of these groups can be right. All people who use drugs deserve a safe, robustly regulated market and care if they're harmed despite those protections. But this goal can only be reached if we reimagine these drug policy categories that we inherited from a century ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm getting some feedback, so let's everyone check your mute function. David, thank you very much. An excellent thought-provoking lecture. It would be a shame, of course, not to have some dialogue with those who have been following your discussion here. Let me ask, if you have a comment or a question for David, let's try to use the raise hand function on this system. And Dennis, if you will help me look for the raised hands, we'll call on individuals who have indicated they want to have some input. I can see myself that Mary Schaefer Conroy has raised her hand. Mary, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, I wanted to ask, it was a very interesting lecture. I wanted to ask about your thoughts on the legalization of marijuana for recreational as well as use, as well as to help people with epilepsy and cancer and like. I come from Colorado, so this is part of our state constitution. And all I can think about is the use of opium in China, you know, in the 19th century and earlier. But I'd like your views on it.
It's a great question that gets right at the heart of the issues that I was talking about. So thank you for that. It strikes me that in a lot of ways in America, our debates over that kind of issue go haywire because of this weird inherited dichotomy that we have always thought about drugs through, so that we have these medicines which are safe and helpful, and we have these drugs which are entirely harmful and bad. And we're always trying to decide, is a drug safe and helpful or harmful and bad? When the truth is that all drugs are both safe and helpful and harmful or bad. So when you talk about decriminalizing marijuana, you know, on the one hand, it's clear that arresting people and throwing them in jail for marijuana isn't doing anybody any good. But on the other hand, handing over marijuana to, say, the tobacco industry or to Purdue Pharma doesn't sound like the best idea either. And so if you reorient the question to begin by asking, how can, since people use drugs, and as this, I hope this lecture shows, there's never really been an effort to stop Americans from using drugs. As a matter of fact, there's been an enormous investment in a huge industry designed to encourage people to use potentially addictive drugs. So assuming for a moment that we're not going to pull a 180 and suddenly decide to really try to stop people from using drugs, the question then becomes, to start with, how can you make this as safe as possible? And that question is left unanswered by simply legalizing a substance. That's really not sufficient at all. You then need to figure out how to regulate it to make it safe, in the same way that people can't sell cars without the best braking technology and airbags and so on and so forth. You certainly shouldn't be able to sell any drug without careful consideration of what the requirements would be to make it as safe as possible for consumers. So I know that different states have been decriminalizing marijuana in different ways, and it's very tricky to get a decriminalization that's accompanied by really robust regulation, because all the people who are in favor of decriminalizing, they tend to be opposed to robust regulations too, because they're either hoping to make money off of it, or they want individual freedom. So in that regard, I would just say I'm in favor of very strongly regulating those markets, although I can't say that I have any problem with not throwing people in jail for drug use.
Thank you. Yeah, it's not, and pharmacists really aren't doing the marijuana growing. It's just individuals, and it is a big, big business, a billion-dollar business. So, thank you.
Yeah.
We're a bit pressed for time, but I see that someone designated as Excel number 2 has raised a hand. Would you like to have a comment or ask a question?
Yes, please. If everybody can understand me, I'm not sure about that.
Sound fine.
Okay, perfect. So somebody might know that oxycodone, which is claimed to be responsible for the opioid crisis in the US today, is a German development of the 1914. So, and it might be interesting to see that in the early 1920s, oxycodone has been regarded as one of the most addictive opioid drugs ever, and it was set under opioid regulation law in 1929 at the time. And what is shown on the last slide of our presenter is the topic of direct-to-consumer advertising. And some people say that the opioid crisis is much more important in the US than it is in Europe. And I'm quite sure that one of the reasons is that direct-to-consumer advertisement has been forbidden in Europe since 1965. So we haven't got that problem. It's even the opposite. So physicians are much too restrictive in prescribing opioids for, let's say, cancer patients and things like that. So they seem to be not to have received enough opioids to control their pain.
Sir, before we turn it over to David Herzberg for a response, could you identify yourself?
I'm sorry, I missed that. What did you say, Bill?
I was asking the individual who just made the comment to identify himself. David, why don't you go ahead with your response?
Sure. I'll go backwards. I'll start with the direct-to-consumer marketing. Interestingly enough, OxyContin and opioids were not formally advertised through direct-to-consumer marketing to the public. And this raises a whole other issue, but they were marketed to the public through non-advertising forms of marketing, by which I mean a lot of public relations stunts, a lot of public education about the issue of chronic pain. But in fact, those kinds of marketing techniques have been used in America long before the 1980s, and I believe that they are used in other countries as well. So it's a little bit more complicated than direct-to-consumer advertising directly, although that's certainly been a factor in other drugs' expansive use. And then for the earlier point, yes, oxycodone. I have a side project with a colleague in France, Nils Kessel, that we're looking at the history, a German and American history of Oikodal. And interestingly enough, oxycodone, a number of pharmaceuticals companies attempted to introduce oxycodone in America in the 40s, claiming that it was less addictive because it was chemically more similar to codeine than to morphine. And they made all kinds of extravagant claims, but federal authorities stopped them and said, no, obviously oxycodone is very addictive. And so it's especially interesting that 50 years later, Purdue Pharma was able to market this drug as if it were less addictive when it had already been determined by American authorities half a century previous that this drug was equally addictive as morphine. So I would love to spend another whole half an hour on the origins specifically of today's opioid crisis, rather than the broad historical context I just gave. But I'm afraid that would take too long, and I know there's other matters to attend to.
Thank you, David. I see one more hand raised, and we'll take that as our final comment or question from Richard Del Rio. And let's try to be brief with the question and the response, and we'll get on to other agenda items then. Thank you so much.
This question is written. I'm going to read it. Oop, it disappeared. Okay, hold on. I had seen a question. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. Hi, David. Thank you for the insightful lecture. I have a few questions. First, can you? Hold on. First, can you? Can you give some insight on the statistical portions of the talk? How are you accounting for addiction rates in the post-Civil War period? What survey are you using to cover the dosage statistics over the 70 years from 1895 to 1960? And second, the 1970s are popularly glorified as one of the legendary periods of cocaine as a party drug. Do you see any relation to the sudden decline in prescriptions for barbiturates in 1960s? Let's see. For the first bit, I will tell you that the sources that I use, I have a database of the annual sales of all categories of psychoactive pharmaceuticals from 1870 to the present, and it uses dozens of different sources. And I'll be happy to talk with you about those by email directly afterwards. Addiction rates, those were maximum addiction rates. They're just taken from court rate. Let's see. The second question is, let's see. Oh yeah, the 1970s. I find this totally fascinating. The 1970s have a reputation as this drug-suffused decade, when in fact, as for most of what I'm able to tell, most rates of drug use were going down in the 1970s, but drug use became so much more visible because authorities recognized that people other than people in central cities were using drugs. So more kinds of drug use got reported on, and this was actually part of what made campaigns to reduce drug use successful. So the 70s are much better seen as a period of contracting drug use than expanding drug use, even though cocaine is an exception, but even it use of it doesn't become widespread until the 80s.